The year 1897 clung to the isolated settlement of Red Hollow like a damp shroud. This small mining town, nestled deep within the shadowed folds of the Appalachian Mountains, was perpetually scarred by the chill of its namesake clay and the persistent whisper of the wind through the pines. Dr. Elias Thorne, a man whose reputation in genetic anthropology preceded him and often followed with a cloud of controversy, stepped off the steam-driven coach, the metallic grate of its brakes a jarring noise in the quiet dusk. He adjusted his spectacles, the weak light catching the tired lines around his eyes. Thorne wasn't here for the minerals. He was here for a rumor. A whisper passed through the hallowed, yet often morally compromised halls of the American Scientific Institute. The rumor was of a man found near the abandoned ironclad mine, whose biological makeup defied contemporary understanding, a genetic anomaly that, if proven, would shatter the foundations of evolutionary science. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of coal smoke, damp earth, and something indefinable, something metallic and old. The town, a haphazard collection of grey, weather-beaten shacks and one imposing, soot-stained laboratory structure, offered little in the way of welcome. The few townsfolk who eyed Thorne did so with a silent, heavy suspicion, the kind of gaze that suggested deep-seated secrets and a fierce mistrust of outsiders, particularly educated ones carrying leather-bound journals and heavy sample cases. He found his contact, Samuel Croft, in the only establishment that offered both a meal and lodging, the Rusty Shovel Inn. Croft, a gaunt, perpetually worried man who served as the town's de facto chronicler and occasional paramedic, was hunched over a watery soup. "Dr. Thorne," Croft muttered, barely looking up, his voice raspy. "Didn't think you'd actually come. City men usually turn tail once they smell the real dirt of Red Hollow." Thorne sat, placing his heavy bag carefully on the worn wooden floor. "I came for the man, Mr. Croft. The anomaly, what you described in your telegraph. It was vague, but compelling. You said his cellular structure was archaic." Croft looked around nervously, though the room was sparsely populated. "Archaic isn't the word, Doctor. It's impossible. When they found him, near the collapsed shaft, he was unconscious, near death. No wounds, just exhausted. My initial blood work, crude as it is here, showed markers. DNA strands, Doctor. Primitive. Organized in a sequence that predates any known human lineage. Like a branch on the evolutionary tree that was supposed to have withered and fallen off 1,000,000 years ago." Thorne felt a familiar intellectual thrill, a dangerous mix of excitement and cold, professional dread. He reached for his notebook. "Tell me about the subject. Physical description. Behavior. Where is he now?" "We've kept him isolated in the old assay lab. Nobody else knows the extent of what he is. They just think he's a miner who got lost and is suffering from a miner's lung, though he shows none of the typical symptoms. He's tall, muscular, but not like a typical laborer. His eyes, they're too deep-set, and he never speaks, just stares, like he's trying to decipher a language we haven't invented yet." The mystery was already thickening. Thorne had dedicated his career to pushing the boundaries of what was biologically possible, often facing ethical review boards for his unorthodox methods. This was the ultimate, horrifying confirmation of his most radical theories about genetic deviation and hidden evolutionary paths. Later that night, the rain began, a relentless cold drumming on the tin roof of the abandoned assay laboratory. The air inside was sterile, cold, and smelled sharply of carbolic acid and dust. Thorne stood before the subject's isolated cell. The subject, a man in his late 30s by appearance, was sitting on a cot, his back ramrod straight, staring at a blank concrete wall. "Subject 0, Thorne murmured, adjusting the lamp. He approached the bars, his scientific detachment struggling against a creeping, almost instinctual unease. The man's musculature was unnaturally dense, his posture rigid. When the subject slowly turned his head, Thorne's blood chilled. The eyes weren't just deep-set, They were intelligent, filled with an ancient, profound knowing. They held no malice, but rather a chilling, detached evaluation of Thorne himself. "My name is Dr. Elias Thorne," he said, his voice measured and professional. "I am here to understand who you are." The subject remained silent, but as Thorne took a step closer, preparing a syringe to draw a fresh sample, a necessary, risky move, the subject did something unexpected. He subtly shifted his hand, revealing a small, faint but distinct scar on his forearm. It wasn't a wound from the mine. It was a perfectly symmetrical, deliberate pattern of 3 converging lines. A symbol. Thorne froze, the syringe needle momentarily forgotten. The scar was identical to one documented in a sealed file in his own private study. A file relating to a long-forgotten, highly unethical research project he had vehemently opposed a decade prior. A project the Institute claimed had been utterly destroyed and the staff disbanded. The banned experiment. A sudden, sharp panic seized Thorne. This man wasn't merely an evolutionary anomaly. He was possibly an escapee, a human product of a dangerous, covert science. The genetic structure wasn't archaic. It was engineered to be so. The mystery was no longer a matter of scientific discovery, but one of profound, life-threatening conspiracy. He quickly retreated, his professional curiosity replaced by a survival instinct. He looked at Croft, who had followed him into the lab and was now standing by the door, his face obscured by the shadows and the brim of his hat. "Mr. Croft," Thorne said, his voice low and tight. "Did anyone else before you have access to this man? Any scientists? Anyone who took tissue samples or ran diagnostics?" Croft's shadow seemed to shift, and his silence was suddenly deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was unnaturally flat. "Doctor, they've been waiting for you to arrive. We all have." Thorne turned back towards the cell, but the subject was no longer sitting. He was standing, one hand gripping the steel bars, his eyes burning with an intense, deliberate focus that wasn't just observation, it was recognition. And beneath the cold professionalism of the lab, a terrifying, silent realization dawned on Thorne. The prisoner wasn't the man in the cell. The prisoner was himself. The rain outside intensified, washing away the dirt of the isolated town, but doing nothing to cleanse the mounting dread. Red Hollow was a trap. The secrets of Red Hollow were deeper and darker than Dr. Thorne could ever imagine. If you want to uncover the truth behind the banned experiment and see how the DNA anomaly connects to a sinister, long-forgotten conspiracy, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. The mystery deepens in Chapter 2. The realization hit Thorne with the force of a physical blow. The town was not a backdrop. It was the staging ground. Croft was not a local informant. He was a carefully placed sentinel. The isolation of Red Hollow, once a challenging logistical detail, was now its most terrifying feature. He was trapped. Thorne's mind raced, his scientific training giving way to pure survival strategy. He had to maintain the illusion of cooperation. He turned slowly, keeping his expression neutral despite the seismic shift in his reality. "Waiting for me, Mr. Croft?" Thorne's voice was steady, betraying none of the fear coiling in his stomach. "To what end? The Institute knows I opposed the banned experiment a decade ago. I was the one who called for the inquiry." Croft stepped fully into the dim lamplight, and Thorne noticed a detail he'd missed before. The man's hands, though calloused, were meticulously clean, unlike a typical Red Hollow resident. They were a lab assistant's hands. Croft offered a thin, unsettling smile. "The Institute is complex, Doctor. It has layers. The project you thought was disbanded merely went underground. Red Hollow is the perfect place for an experiment that requires discretion. The townsfolk are compliant. They understand the value of silence. You were the only one who could verify the integrity of the subject's genetic markers. The only one whose professional jealousy, or perhaps ego, would drive him to pursue this rumor, despite the risk. And what is this?" Thorne gestured vaguely toward the cell, careful not to look directly at Subject Zero, whose silence now felt less like a lack of ability and more like a deliberate, terrifying choice. A means of blackmail? To force me to join this clandestine research? No, Doctor. Croft sighed, adjusting the collar of his rough coat. We needed you to authenticate the sample, and now you will help us stabilize the project. You see, the subject is not merely an anomaly. He is a breakthrough, a viable genetic bridge between primitive and modern man. But he is unstable. He suffers from episodes of extreme disorientation and physical stress. That is why he was found near the mine. He fled during a severe episode. Croft produced a key and unlocked a heavy, reinforced steel cabinet. Inside lay Thorne's own scientific case, which Croft must have retrieved from the Rusty Shovel Inn. He pulled out Thorne's specialized microscope, a recent highly valuable German model, and a set of slides. Your work begins now, Doctor. Your accommodation is upstairs. You are to begin with a full analysis of the blood samples I have already collected, and do not, under any circumstances, approach the subject without supervision. Croft's eyes hardened. We know your reputation, Thorne. Your desire to dissect, to prove, to expose. But in Red Hollow, we believe in observation, patience, and absolute secrecy. Thorne felt a brief flicker of hope. He was still a scientist. He still had his tools. If he could understand the man in the cell, truly understand him, he might find a flaw in the entire operation, a way to expose the conspiracy. He had to play their game. Very well, Croft, Thorne said, his voice regaining its professional steel. Give me the samples. I need a clear space, good light, and complete silence. He spent the rest of the night hunched over the microscope, the rain still drumming its relentless rhythm. The silence Croft had promised was broken only by the scratch of Thorne's pen on the laboratory journal and the occasional, almost imperceptible shift of weight from the cell behind him. He analyzed the prepared slides. Croft had not exaggerated. The genetic data was confounding. The base pairs, the mitochondrial DNA, it was structured in a way that should not be viable. It spoke of a biological resilience, a primitive hardiness that was terrifying in its purity. As dawn cast a weak gray light through the single window, Thorne paused, rubbing his tired eyes. He needed a fresh sample, a direct, controlled acquisition. He glanced at the subject, who was now asleep, curled tightly on the cot. Thorne knew the risk. Croft had warned him. But to rely on Croft's pre-prepared samples was to remain a prisoner of their narrative. He needed the raw truth. He retrieved the specialized miniature camera he'd concealed in the false bottom of his case, a device intended for microphotography of cellular structures. He crept to the cell, his heart pounding a frantic counterpoint to the distant clang of the early shift bell from the distant, still active mines. He positioned the camera, focusing on the subject's face. He catalogued the subtle, unusual bone structure, the thicker brow ridge, the slightly wider nasal cavity, all hints of a more ancient lineage. Then, he focused on the scar he'd seen the night before, 3 converging lines. As he was about to retreat, he noticed a second scar, partially hidden by the man's hairline. This one was different. It wasn't a symbol. It was a faint, nearly imperceptible ring of tiny, equidistant pinpricks circling the base of the skull, just above the neck. Thorne's mind flashed back to his reading of the suppressed files from the Band experiment. The project wasn't just about genetic manipulation, it was about control. The ultimate aim was to create a human subject of superior physical resilience and compliant intellect. The ring of pinpricks, it was consistent with the initial phases of a cranial implant procedure, a device designed to regulate brain chemistry and enforce obedience. The anomaly wasn't just a biological freak, he was a weapon, and the control mechanism was failing. That was why he was unstable. That was why he was here. Thorne snapped the picture, the faint click of the mechanism echoing loudly in the cold silence. He spun around to leave, only to find Croft standing in the doorway, a chillingly calm expression on his face, holding a length of thick rope. A fresh sample wasn't necessary, Doctor. Croft said softly. But taking unauthorized photographs? That's a serious breach of confidentiality. Thorne backed away, adrenaline surging. He saw the shift in Croft's eyes. The scientific collaborator was gone, replaced by the jailer. He is unstable, Croft, Thorne argued, desperately trying to appeal to the man's scientific side. The implant is failing. He's suffering. You need to remove it, or he will die, and your experiment will be wasted. Croft smiled again, a terrible, devoid of humor expression. You assume the subject's life is the primary concern, Doctor. It is not. The success of the genetic line is, and your cooperation now is non-negotiable. He lunged forward and Thorne stumbled back, tripping over his own case. He shielded his head, but the expected blow didn't come. Instead, a piercing, inhuman groan erupted from the cell behind them. Subject 0 was awake. Croft hesitated, his eyes flicking to the cell, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his face. This momentary lapse was all the chance Thorne needed. He scrambled to his feet and bolted for the door, clutching the camera. He could hear Croft shouting behind him, followed by the terrifying sound of steel bars being wrenched, metal grinding against stone. The subject was breaking out. Thorne burst out into the misty morning of Red Hollow. He was no longer a researcher. He was a fugitive. The town, silent and grey, suddenly felt like a labyrinth of watchful, hostile eyes. The suspense had broken into open terror. He had to find help, or at least a way to transmit the photograph and the truth. Thorne ran, the cold, damp clay of the street sucking at his leather boots. His lungs burned in the sharp mountain air, an air that tasted faintly of coal dust and fear. Behind him, the shouts of Croft and a heavier, more guttural sound, the subject's escape, echoed through the narrow gaps between the miners' shacks. He knew he couldn't outrun them. Not for long. Red Hollow was a community built on a conspiracy, and its inhabitants, he now realized, were all accomplices. Every closed window, every curtain twitch, felt like a silent, hostile witness. He desperately needed shelter and, more importantly, a neutral party. The Rusty Shovel Inn was compromised. The assay lab was the prison. His only hope lay in the one other structure that hinted at official presence, the old, dilapidated telegraph office near the train tracks. He cut down an alleyway, past a pile of rotting wooden crates, momentarily losing sight of his pursuers. He risked a glance at the miniature camera in his hand. The image of the cranial pinpricks was proof that the subject was not a natural anomaly, but a man tortured and altered by unethical science, a man whose stability was now the town's greatest threat. As he reached the edge of the main street, he bumped directly into a young woman. She was carrying a heavy canvas bag, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes held a clarity that was shockingly out of place in this atmosphere of oppressive secrecy. "Please, sir, you must be careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her name, he would later learn, was Clara, the daughter of the local doctor who had disappeared months ago. "They are watching. They know you have the truth." "Who are they?" Thorne panted, gripping her arm. "Croft? The Institute?" "The entire town, sir. They are all paid. Not with money, not entirely. They were promised a cure for the black lung, for the mining sickness that kills everyone here. They believe that he," she nodded discreetly toward the direction of the lab, "holds the key. They call him the prototype." Clara's revelation added a horrifying layer to the mystery. The townsfolk weren't just protecting a secret, they were protecting a promise. A desperate, hope-driven rationale for their silence and complicity. "I need to get to the telegraph office," Thorne said, his voice urgent. "I need to send a message. Expose this." Clara shook her head quickly, her face etched with fear. "The lines are monitored, Doctor. They have been since the experiment began. But there is a way. My father, he had a connection. An old, forgotten line that runs through the abandoned ironclad mine shaft, an escape route he prepared. The mine? The one where the subject was found? Yes. It's the last place they will look for a connection to the outside. But we have to move now. They will secure the town borders soon." A sound like cracking timber, followed by a low, drawn-out moan, made them both flinch. Subject Zero was close. His agitation meant the control mechanism was failing rapidly. "The implant," Thorne explained quickly. "It's breaking down. The man is suffering, and when the control fails completely, his physical power will be uncontrollable. He is not malicious. He is chemically, biologically unstable." Clara grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Come with me, I know the tunnels my father taught me." They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows. As they passed the general store, Thorne caught a glimpse of a hastily written note pinned to the door. "Curfew in effect. Search for the fugitive. Reward offered for his capture." The trap was fully sprung. They reached the mine entrance, a gaping, jagged hole in the mountainside, framed by decaying wooden supports. The air here was colder, carrying the sharp metallic tang of iron ore and the deep, unsettling quiet of an abandoned place. "The line is deep inside, past the first collapse," Clara whispered, pulling a small, flickering lantern from her bag. "We must be silent." The smallest sound echoes. They descended into the mine. The darkness immediately swallowed the meager light of the Red Hollow morning. The shaft was narrow, slick with moisture, and the rhythmic drip of water intensified the suffocating silence. Thorne, a man of laboratories and libraries, felt a primal claustrophobia set in. "My father started this line because he suspected what was happening," Clara said, her voice strained by the darkness. "He thought they were trying to create a worker who didn't need rest, who was immune to the dust. But he realized they were creating something monstrously resilient. When he tried to warn the outside, they made him disappear." Thorne felt a sharp jolt of guilt. He had opposed the idea of the banned experiment. Clara's father had opposed the reality. "If we can get this message out," Thorne said, adjusting his spectacles, "we can not only save ourselves but potentially save that man, Subject Zero, from a fate worse than death." As they navigated the treacherous, uneven floor, they suddenly heard voices. Not Croft's, but those of two rough-sounding miners. They were close, moving down a parallel shaft, their lanterns casting dancing shadows. "He's a fool, that scientist," one miner growled. "Thought he could come to Red Hollow and poke his nose where it didn't belong. The reward money will buy my wife a proper cough syrup." "Don't worry about the money," the second miner hissed. "Worry about the prototype. If he's truly loose and the brain box is failing, Red Hollow won't be safe for anyone. We were promised control. The Institute lied." Their words confirmed Thorne's worst fears. The conspiracy was unraveling from the inside, driven by the subject's instability. The town was not merely a jail, it was a powder keg. Thorne and Clara flattened themselves against a cold, wet wall. The miners passed, their heavy boots scraping the stone, their voices fading. "We are near the collapse," Clara breathed, her hand trembling as she held the lantern. "Be careful. The air is thin." They reached a section where the roof had caved in, forming a small, precarious tunnel underneath the debris. Squeezing through, they emerged into a cavernous space. And there, draped across a broken wooden support beam, was a thin, heavily insulated copper wire, the illicit telegraph line. Thorne set down his case. He was safe, for now. He pulled out the tiny, collapsible telegraph key he carried for field communications. He began to work, his fingers moving quickly, connecting his device to the abandoned line. A desperate man sending a desperate message into the void. He would send the coordinates of Red Hollow, the name of the banned experiment, the facts about the genetic engineering, and the proof, the camera containing the photograph of the cranial implant marks. He would address the message to his most trusted former colleague in Washington, betting his life on her integrity. Suddenly, a shadow fell over them. The cavern's entrance was blocked. Standing there, silhouetted against the weak light, was Subject Zero. He wasn't aggressive, he looked pained, disoriented, his huge body swaying slightly. The silence of the mine had been broken by his approach. Thorne froze. This was not the time for science. This was the time for the survival instinct the subject himself seemed to embody. The subject's eyes, wide and unfocused, seemed to look through Thorne, but his gaze settled on Clara. Subject Zero stood motionless, his silhouette a hulking distortion in the mine entrance. He was clearly suffering. His breathing was shallow and ragged, and his massive hands were clenching and unclenching involuntarily. He wasn't tracking them with aggression, but with a profound, unfocused distress. Thorne, despite the primal terror, saw the situation through the lens of a scientist. The cranial implant, the brain box the miner mentioned, was regulating the subject's adrenaline, his fight-or-flight responses, perhaps even his basic emotional control. Its failure meant the subject was now drowning in a chemical maelstrom. Clara, however, reacted with surprising calm. She slowly raised her lantern, the light illuminating the subject's face. "You're hurt," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "We are not here to hurt you. We are here to help ourselves and you." The subject's gaze locked onto her, and for the first time, Thorne saw a flicker of something human. A desperate plea for understanding, quickly masked by the sheer physiological torment. Thorne seized the moment. His fingers resumed their frantic work on the telegraph key. Danger. Red Hollow. Experiment subject. 0. Genetic manipulation confirmed. Implant failure. Urgent assistance required. Before he could send the full coordinates, Subject Zero took a staggering step forward, and a low, resonant sound, a sound that echoed the deep tremor of the earth, came from his chest. The noise! It's the implant! Thorne realized, his mind racing. The device is vibrating, failing to regulate. It's causing him excruciating pain. "We have to move," Clara urged, pulling on Thorne's arm. "Wait," Thorne said, a sudden terrifying insight striking him. He remembered the scar on the subject's forearm, the 3 converging lines. "Clara, the symbol. Did your father ever mention anything about that specific mark?" Clara looked at the subject's arm, which was now trembling violently. "Yes. My father said it was a signature. Not of the Institute, but of the specific researcher who headed the project, Dr. Alistair Rain. He was obsessed with the idea of genetic optimization and believed he was operating outside all moral bounds. He marked his masterpieces. Rane. The name sent a chill through Thorne. Rane hadn't just been a colleague. He had been Thorne's fiercest rival, a man whose ambition was only surpassed by his sociopathy. Rane was supposed to have vanished after the initial inquiry. This meant Rane wasn't just the architect of the band experiment, he was likely still running it, here in Red Hollow. "If Rane is here," Thorne muttered, the suspense tightening its grip, "then the local operation Croft, the miners, they are all his subordinates. This is deeper than just a suppressed Institute project." Suddenly the subject's head snapped up. He wasn't looking at them. He was staring at the cavern roof. He let out a piercing, raw cry of agony, clutching his temples. Then he turned and crashed through a pile of loose rock, vanishing deeper into an unexplored passage of the mine. "He's fleeing the noise," Clara realized. "He can't tolerate the pressure or the sound of the town." "No," Thorne corrected, looking down at his hand. The telegraph key, now connected, was humming faintly. "He's fleeing the frequency. The implant reacts to specific sonic waves. They must have installed a high-frequency regulator in the town to keep him docile. When the implant fails, the frequency becomes an instrument of torture." Thorne quickly finished his message, tapping out the last crucial digits of the Washington contact. He pulled the wire free, securing the camera to his belt. "We need to leave this mine now, Clara," Thorne said, his voice decisive. "I've sent the message. But if Rane is here, he will have contingency plans. We are no longer safe underground." As they scrambled back towards the exit, navigating the narrow tunnel, they heard distant, muffled voices. Croft and the search party were returning, searching the deeper shafts. They finally emerged from the mouth of the ironclad mine, blinking in the weak afternoon light. The town below was unnervingly quiet. No shouts, no activity. It was the calm before a storm. "The silence is worse," Clara observed, gripping her lantern tightly. "It means they've found something, or they are executing a plan." Thorne's blood ran cold as he realized the implication. Rain is forcing the issue. If the subject's instability is increasing, Rane won't try to recapture him. He'll try to activate him, to control him one last time, even if it means destroying him. They had to get out of Red Hollow. They began a cautious, desperate climb up the steep, forested slope away from the mine, heading toward the pass that led out of the valley. Every step was a battle against the slick clay and the oppressive silence. They were near the ridge when they heard a sound that was far more terrifying than the subject's cry, the distinctive metallic click of a rifle bolt being drawn back. "Stop, Dr. Thorne," a voice commanded, sharp and cultured, echoing off the rock face. A man stepped out from behind a thick pine tree. He was impeccably dressed in a tweed suit, utterly incongruous with the rugged setting. He was tall, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a precise, predatory expression. Dr. Alistair Rain, the architect of the banned experiment, and he held a hunting rifle pointed directly at Thorne's chest. "I confess, Thorne, I am disappointed," Rane said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I expected a more refined approach to your inevitable intervention. Running through the mud like a common fugitive is beneath your intellect." Clara gasped, pulling Thorne behind her, a protective but futile gesture. "Leave us alone, Rane. The town knows what you are doing. They know about my father." Rain chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "Poor, misguided Clara. Your father simply had a crisis of conscience. And the town? The town wants the promise fulfilled. They want their resilience, their own genetic optimization. You see, Thorne, Subject Zero was merely the prototype. The true banned experiment is Red Hollow itself." The terrifying depth of the conspiracy was now clear. Ron wasn't just manipulating one man, he was manipulating an entire community, using their desperation for survival as a shield for his illegal science. The horror wasn't in the monster, but in the monstrous ambition of the man holding the gun. The rifle's cold, polished wood seemed to absorb all the light. Dr. Alistair Rain stood perfectly still, his composure the most unnerving element in the entire chaotic situation. He was not a brute. He was a meticulous scientist who saw human life as mere material. "Lower the rifle, Rane," Thorne said, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, his mind working furiously. He had to stall, to distract, to find a weakness in Rane's pathological confidence. "Your experiment is failing. Subject Zero is unstable. If you pull that trigger, the attention will be on Red Hollow immediately, nullifying your years of work." Rane sighed, a sound of profound intellectual weariness. "That is where you, as always, misunderstand the essence of true scientific progress, Thorne. Failure is merely an iteration, and Subject Zero is not the core of the work." Rain motioned with the rifle toward Clara. "Tell him, Clara. Tell Dr. Thorne what your father, Dr. Edmund Hayes, was attempting to document before his unfortunate departure." Clara's eyes were wide, but she kept her voice steady. "My father realized Rane was using the town's water supply, which runs through the ironclad mine, to introduce a sequence of gene-editing agents. Low-level, persistent exposure. The miners were exposed to accelerate their physical adaptation to the brutal mining conditions. Rane promised they would be stronger, immune to the black lung." "A slow-motion genetic modification," Thorne finished, the horror crystallizing in his mind. "You weren't looking for one breakthrough, Rain. You were cultivating an entirely new, obedient human population, all under the guise of medical assistance." "Precisely," Rane confirmed, a hint of genuine pride in his voice. "The banned experiment was never about Subject Zero. It was about scalability. Zero was the control subject given the full, high-intensity dosage to prove viability and resilience. He was a success. The town, however, is a long-term, low-intensity trial, the proof of environmental adaptation. This is the future of human engineering, Thorne, and it is glorious." "It's monstrous," Thorne spat, the scientist in him battling the ethical man. "You've infected an entire community without their knowledge or consent. And what are the long-term side effects?" Rane lowered the rifle slightly, a gesture of intellectual respect. The side effects. That's why you're here, Thorn. The instability of Subject Zero is the key. The low-level exposure in the town seems to be causing subtle, cumulative psychological changes. Increased suspicion, paranoia, and a rigid adherence to authority, a collective blindness to logic. The townsfolk are becoming simplified, compliant. Thorn looked at Clara. Her pale, intelligent face was a stark contrast to Rane's description of the town's simplified psyche. Clara is immune, he noted. Clara's father removed her from the valley's water supply years ago, a precautionary measure he took as he grew suspicious. Rane explained, his eyes never leaving the two fugitives. A calculated anomaly which allowed her to see what others could not. A shame. It would have been cleaner if she too was simply compliant. Suddenly the ground beneath them shifted, not a tremor, but a heavy, rhythmic vibration. It was coming from the valley floor, specifically from the direction of the old assay lab. A deep, resonant thrumming began, increasing in volume and intensity. The sonic regulator, Thorn realized. You've activated the failsafe. You are trying to use the town's sound system to control Subject Zero, even though the implant is failing. Rane's composure finally cracked, a flash of anxiety in his eyes. I needed to contain him. He must be neutralized before he reaches the main settlement and causes irreversible damage. His enhanced strength, coupled with his current chemical frenzy, is a catastrophic risk. The thrumming was now a physical presence, vibrating in Thorn's teeth. Clara cried out, clutching her ears. It's not just for Subject Zero, Rain. Thorn deduced, a final piece of the mystery falling into place. It's for the town. The frequency is meant to trigger the compliance in the townsfolk, to turn them into an obedient mob who will search for and neutralize the subject and us. As if on cue, a distant, unified shout rose from the valley floor, carried on the wind, a horrifying, emotionless chorus of voices. The townsfolk were mobilizing. You are a brilliant man, Thorn, Ronnie admitted, his finger moving to the rifle trigger. But your sense of timing is deplorable. It's a pity your last official act will be to verify the success of my genetic compliance protocol. Thorn knew this was the end of the stalling. He had the camera, the proof, and the horrifying truth of Rane's global ambition. He had to act. Clara, move, Thorn yelled, throwing his entire body to the side, simultaneously kicking a cluster of loose rocks down the steep slope. The noise and the sudden movement were enough. Rain fired, the rifle's report echoing violently through the mountain pass. But the shot went wide, striking the trunk of the pine tree where Rane had been concealed. Thorn tumbled down the treacherous incline, pulling Clara with him. The world dissolved into a chaos of slick clay, rolling stones, and sharp pine needles. When he finally skidded to a stop, his spectacles were gone, his clothes were torn, and a searing pain shot up his leg. But he was alive. Rain, momentarily disoriented by the fall, was regaining his footing on the ridge, his silhouette visible against the gray sky. You cannot escape, Thorn. Rain's voice was a cold, high shriek of rage. You will verify the experiment one way or another. Clara, despite her terror, had managed to keep hold of her bag. The train station, she gasped, pointing to a barely visible, overgrown track line far below them. The morning coach is still scheduled. It's our only chance, but we have to cross the creek. Thorn squinted, his vision blurry without his glasses. The sound of the mob's shouts was growing louder, closer. The combined force of the psychological compliance frequency and Ronnie's direct command was mobilizing the entire, genetically altered town. They were not being chased by men. They were being hunted by a chemically controlled, compliant, and numerous force. He looked down at his bloodied hand. He still held the miniature camera. The proof was safe. Now, they had to survive the descent and the onslaught of the compliance-driven Red Hollow population. The descent toward the forgotten train line was treacherous. Thorn's leg throbbed with every movement, but the pure adrenaline of escaping Rane and the impending mob kept him moving. Clara, despite her small stature, showed a resilience forged by years of living under the shadow of the banned experiment. She practically dragged him down the slick, reddish-brown slope. The sonic thrumming from the valley had changed. It was no longer just a regulatory pulse, it was a rhythmic, almost tribal beat that seemed to synchronize with the collective shouts of the approaching townsfolk. Thorn realized Rane wasn't just attempting to control Subject Zero. He was actively inducing a state of compliant, controlled frenzy in the residents. They reached the valley floor and plunged immediately into the dense thicket surrounding the Red Creek, a sluggish, muddy tributary that ran parallel to the train tracks. The creek water was shallow, but the banks were thick with reeds and heavy, clinging mud. "We have to stay in the water," Thorn whispered, pulling a handful of reeds to mask their passage. "The mud will muffle our sounds, and the reeds will break the line of sight." "My father said the creek is the most dangerous part," Clara whispered back, her face streaked with mud and tears. "The water flow is erratic here. The banks shift without warning." As they waded through the knee-deep, freezing water, Thorn noticed something unsettling. The creek wasn't flowing normally. It was moving too fast, too sluggishly in places, creating odd, turbulent eddies. He looked at the water itself, noticing the reddish-brown tint was deeper here, almost the color of rust. "Clara, the water," Thorn began, but he was interrupted by the horrifying sound of the first townsfolk reaching the top of the slope they had just descended. They were screaming Rane's commands, their voices devoid of individual personality, a monstrous collective drone. Thorn risked a glance back. He saw a wave of dark, gray-clad figures spilling over the ridge, moving with an unnatural, coordinated speed. They were holding pickaxes, shovels, and lengths of chain. "They are fully compliant," Thorn gasped. "The frequency is working. They've lost all semblance of individual thought." Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave way. The bank collapsed silently, and Thorn plunged into a sinkhole of thick, clinging mud and fast-flowing water. He lost his grip on Clara and the bank. The camera, his only physical proof, was still clutched in his hand. He struggled against the suction of the mud, his injured leg screaming in protest. He managed to grab a tangle of roots, pulling himself partially free. Clara immediately turned, frantically reaching for him. "Thorn, hold on." As she pulled, a terrifying shape emerged from the muddy water near her feet. It was Subject Zero. He was submerged up to his chest, the water swirling violently around his powerful frame. He wasn't running, he was using the creek as a covert travel route. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed on Clara, but not with violence, with a desperate animalistic recognition. Thorn saw the symbol on Subject Zero's forearm, the 3 converging lines, now slick and darker with water. Then he looked at Clara's hand, which was clutching a small, smooth stone she had picked up from the creek bank. On the stone, faintly carved, was the same symbol. "The symbol," Thorn shouted, the realization cutting through the terror. "It's a sign of origin, Clara. A mark of identity, not just Rane's signature." Clara understood instantly. She let go of the roots and slowly held up the stone to Subject Zero, her hand trembling. "It's from the valley," she whispered. "It's old. It was here before them." The subject's entire demeanor changed. The frenzy in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a momentary profound stillness. He reached out a massive hand, his fingers brushing against the stone. It was a gesture of connection, not aggression. The chemical storm in his brain was momentarily calmed by a shred of memory or identity associated with the symbol. But the moment of respite was violently broken. A group of 3 townsmen, their faces vacant and driven, appeared on the bank directly above them. They didn't hesitate. They hurled their shovels down. One shovel narrowly missed Clara. The other struck Subject Zero on the shoulder, a heavy, sickening thud of metal on bone. The subject let out a roar of pain and pure, uncontrolled rage. The brief moment of clarity vanished. He was a cornered animal, chemically tortured and physically attacked. He lunged out of the water, a terrifying, mud-covered figure of primitive strength. He didn't attack Thorn or Clara. He turned his terrifying strength on the townsman. With one swift, brutal movement, He wrenched the shovel from the compliant man's hand and tossed him aside like a rag doll. "Run! Now!" Thorn yelled, pulling himself completely free of the mud. Clara and Thorn scrambled toward the old train tracks, hidden partially by a stand of poplars. The air was now filled with the sound of the fight, the subjects' guttural cries, the cracking of timber, and the compliant mob's unified, emotionless screams. They reached the train tracks, their surface rusted and overgrown. The tracks led away from Red Hollow toward the nearest major town, the last vestige of the outside world. "The coach should be here in minutes," Clara said, her eyes fixed on the distant curve of the mountain. But as they looked down the track, a horrifying sight materialized. The track was not clear. A group of compliant townsfolk, led by a man with a heavy sledgehammer, were frantically working to tear up the ties and rails, a desperate, Ran-ordered measure to ensure no one escaped. They were minutes from complete isolation. The screams of the mob were closing in from the creekside. The metallic thrumming was deafening. Suddenly, a flicker of hope, a distant whistle, the sound of a steam engine nearing the curve. The morning coach. Thorn looked at the group on the tracks, then back at the approaching mob. He was trapped between two compliant forces, one destroying his escape route, the other closing in for the capture. He needed a distraction, a big one. He looked at the camera in his hand, then at the nearby abandoned mining signal tower, a tall, rickety wooden structure designed to relay emergency messages to the depot. "Clara, I need you to climb the tower," Thorn said, his voice raw with exhaustion and urgency. "I need you to signal the train, pull the emergency rope, give them any signal you can. I will distract the mob on the track." Clara looked at the tower, then back at the approaching frantic mob. She nodded, her face hardened by resolve. "Be careful, Doctor. Rainey is waiting." Thorn did not waste time. He ran toward the track, not toward the train, but toward the compliant group tearing up the rails. He knew he had to stop them, even for a second, to allow the train to reach the station. His survival now hinged on a desperate, suicidal act of intervention against Rane's obedient, genetically manipulated foot soldiers. The ultimate tension of the human drama was now a foot race against a controlled frenzy. Thorn sprinted down the overgrown tracks, his injured leg protesting with every stride. The group of compliant townsfolk, wielding the sledgehammer and crowbars, barely reacted to his approach. They were focused solely on the task assigned by Rane, disabling the escape route. The rhythmic, sonic thrum was at its peak, locking them into a terrifying, singular purpose. He couldn't fight them. He had to disrupt the compliance. He skidded to a stop just meters from the group. He reached into his coat and pulled out the only weapon he had, a small vial of highly concentrated carbolic acid, a necessity for sanitizing samples, which he had snatched from the assay lab. "Stop! The acid is volatile," Thorn yelled, not expecting them to understand, but hoping the sudden sharp sound might break their focus. As the man with the sledgehammer raised the tool to crush the last remaining spike, Thorn hurled the vial. It shattered on the rails, the pungent, acrid smell of the chemical immediately vaporizing in the cool air. The men paused, their noses twitching. The strong, foreign chemical smell, a sensory overload, was just enough to create a tiny fissure in the sonic-induced compliance. A momentary confusion replaced the vacant look in their eyes. "What is that smell?" one of them muttered, his voice cracking, a sign of individual thought returning. The momentary lapse was all Thorn needed. He capitalized on the confusion, shoving the man with the sledgehammer and vaulting over the partially damaged track. He scrambled toward the towering wooden signal box, directly across from the section of damaged rail. Meanwhile, Clara had reached the base of the signal tower. It was rickety and steep, but she ascended with desperate speed, the canvas bag containing her father's notes swinging against the wooden frame. The train whistle sounded again, closer now, a long, mournful blast cutting through the thrumming. The locomotive was almost in sight. Rane, appearing on the ridge where he'd chased Thorn and Clara, saw the twin threats immediately. The townspeople momentarily distracted, and Clara ascending the tower. Do not let her reach the signal. Rane shrieked, his voice carrying clearly over the thrumming. Stop the train! Stop her! Rane's direct, authoritative command, the voice of the architect, snapped the townsfolk out of their chemical daze. Their faces reset into the vacant masks of compliant rage. They turned and surged toward Thorn and the signal tower. Thorn knew he had minutes. He reached the signal box, a small wooden hut housing the necessary levers and a spare lantern. He could see the train's headlight rounding the bend, a beacon of hope against the deepening psychological darkness of Red Hollow. Clara reached the top platform. The emergency signal rope was there, thick and frayed. She pulled it with all her strength. A loud, clanging bell rang out, and a red signal lantern swung violently on its hinge, signaling danger. Stop. The train's brakes shrieked, a long, agonizing sound of steel on steel. The locomotive began to slow, but it was still too far to stop before it reached the damaged section of the rail. The compliant mob was now closing in. Thorn was trapped inside the signal box, its flimsy wooden walls offering no protection. He reached for the lantern he had seen, igniting the wick. He looked out the window. The train was now visible less than 100 yards away. The tracks were severed. If it hit the broken rail, the derailment would be catastrophic, killing everyone and obliterating any chance of escape or proof. He realized his plan was flawed. The signal wouldn't stop the train in time. It would only alert the conductor to the danger. He had to guide the train past the damaged section. Thorn frantically scanned the signal box, his fingers desperately searching for something, anything. He found an emergency lever, a rusty, heavy piece of iron used for routing trains onto a seldom-used maintenance siding, a rarely used but intact parallel track. He pulled the lever. With a protesting groan, the points on the track shifted, the rails grinding loudly. The switch was made. He then grabbed the lit lantern and burst out of the signal box. The compliant mob was meters away, their faces contorted with Rainey's instructed rage. Thorn positioned himself between the mob and the switch. He held the lantern high, waving it in a complex rhythmic pattern. An old railway code. Proceed slowly, alternate route. The train conductor, a grizzled man with a deep suspicion of any signal from the notorious Red Hollow siding, squinted. He saw the frantic movements, the swinging red signal above, and the man waving the lantern below. He understood the urgency, if not the meaning. He eased the massive locomotive onto the parallel maintenance siding. The engine rumbled past Thorn, close enough for him to feel the blast of steam and the heat of the boiler. The noise, the sheer non-compliant noise of the massive machine, was shattering the sonic thrum. The compliant townsfolk hesitated, clutching their heads, the uniformity of their rage breaking apart under the auditory assault. Thorn knew he had only seconds. He ran alongside the passenger cars as they clattered slowly past. Clara, seeing his move, scrambled down the tower and ran to meet him. As the caboose lumbered by, Thorn grabbed the handrail and hoisted himself up, pulling Clara with him. They tumbled onto the brake platform, scraping their knees. They were safe, temporarily. He looked back at Red Hollow, the town of red clay and murderous science. Rane, standing on the ridge, was now a small, enraged figure, his tweed suit a dark stain against the mountainside. He was shaking his fist, his grand experiment on the verge of exposure. The compliant mob, their compliance shattered by the train's noise and the shock of the escape, were now standing still, looking confused and lost, their manufactured frenzy evaporated. But the most terrifying sight was the one, Subject Zero. He was standing on the tracks, in the exact spot where the train had passed, his head bowed, his massive body racked with tremors. The chemical hell was visible in his posture. The train began to accelerate, pulling them away from the valley of horror. Thorn slumped against the cold metal wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had the camera. He had Clara. He had survived. Dr. Thorn and Clara have escaped Rain's trap. But the secret of the band experiment is still a long way from being exposed. The unstable Subject Zero is still loose, and Rane will stop at nothing to silence them. To follow their desperate race against the conspiracy and discover the chilling conclusion, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. The final 3 chapters will uncover the ultimate twist. The escape was a physical and psychological shock. The train thundered down the tracks, rapidly putting distance between them and Red Hollow. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was a comforting, mechanical sound, a stark contrast to the oppressive, manufactured thrumming of Rane's sonic regulator. Thorn and Clara found an empty compartment. Thorn's leg was bleeding badly, and Clara immediately set about cleaning and binding the wound with strips of cloth from her shirt. She moved with a practical, calm determination that belied her young age. "We are safe, Dr. Thorn," Clara whispered, tying the knot securely. "The train, they won't follow us far. Ron can't risk public exposure by pursuing us across state lines." "He won't need to," Thorn rasped, clutching the camera. "Rain is a scientist, Clara, a calculating man. He will have contingencies. He won't rely on a handful of compliant miners to recapture us. He will work through official channels." Thorn then realized the terrible implication of his escape. He had successfully telegraphed his Washington colleague, Dr. Eleanor Vance, but he had only managed to send a partial message before Ronnie had intervened. "Clara, I only sent the bare minimum, Red Hollow, Experiment 0, genetic manipulation," Thorn explained. "Dr. Vance will be skeptical. Rain will immediately counter with a narrative of his own. We need to be the first to reach Washington, with the photograph as undeniable proof." Thorn managed to pull himself upright, his mind already spinning into overdrive, analyzing the logistics of the conspiracy. Rane is not a lone actor. He is protected by layers of bureaucratic secrecy within the Institute. He will label us as unstable, delusional, perhaps even the creators of the anomaly. "But the truth is on that camera," Clara insisted, her eyes fixed on the small device. "The evidence of the implant, the symbol." "Evidence can be dismissed, Clara," Thorn countered, the fatigue making him cynical. "But timing is everything. We need to secure the photographic proof, find Dr. Vance, and present the full, terrifying scope of Rane's project before he has a chance to sanitize the narrative." He looked out the window. The harsh, rocky landscape was giving way to rolling hills and scattered farms. Civilization was returning, but it felt exposed. The train itself, once a symbol of escape, was now a single, vulnerable metal tube hurtling toward a confrontation. As the train pulled into a small, nondescript station to take on water, Thorn took advantage of the stop. He hobbled to the conductor's cabin. "Sir," Thorn said, his voice urgent, flashing his Institute identification card, a powerful symbol of authority that Rane could not yet have fully revoked. "There has been an emergency. We need to telegraph ahead to Washington, to the Institute. A matter of national security. Private code." The conductor, intimidated by Thorn's intensity and the official card, reluctantly agreed. Thorn sent a second coded message to Dr. Vance, confirming their status as fugitives and reiterating the need for absolute secrecy upon arrival. He added a crucial instruction: secure the original files on Project Chimera, the 1887 prototype study. He knew Rane's project was a direct, advanced iteration of that first, ethically disastrous study. When Thorn returned to the compartment, Clara was staring out the window, her face pale. "I heard the news vendor shouting, Doctor," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "They've already put out a notice. A sensational story." Thorn felt a cold dread. He retrieved a newspaper from a nearby seat. The headline screamed in bold black letters: "Mad Doctor flees with Patient Zero after brutal assault. Scientist Dr. Elias Thorn, exposed as traitor, abducts unstable miner and daughter of missing local physician." The article, clearly planted by Rane through his deep connections, painted Thorn as a rogue agent who had stolen a subject for personal, unauthorized research, using the vulnerable Clara as a decoy. The story was a masterpiece of misdirection, using carefully chosen half-truths to construct an utterly convincing lie. The daughter of the missing local physician. Thorne read aloud, the words tasting like ash. That implicates you, Clara. Makes you an accomplice and a flight risk. My father's disappearance is now a part of their story, Clara realized, tears welling up in her eyes. Ronnie has covered everything. They think we are the danger. Thorne looked at the headline, then at the camera. The conspiracy had moved faster and more efficiently than he had predicted. They were not just running from Ronnie. They were running from a narrative that was already hardening into public consensus. The psychological horror was now a matter of public perception and official manhunt. They spent the rest of the journey in silent, tense anticipation. As the train pulled into the massive, echoing station in Washington, D.C., the seat of government and the home of the Institute, Thorne knew their lives were on a razor's edge. They disembarked, merging into the throng of passengers. The noise, the lights, the crowds. It was a sensory explosion after the claustrophobia of Red Hollow. It should have felt safe, but it felt exposed. We need to avoid the Institute and the police, Thorne instructed, his voice low and firm. We go directly to a secure location and process the film. Then, and only then, do we approach Vance. As they navigated the station's enormous main hall, Thorne's keen eyes scanned the faces. He saw no uniformed police, but he saw men in plain clothes, men with the sharp, indifferent eyes of official security. They were looking for a man with an injured leg and a young woman matching Clara's description. Suddenly, a massive commotion erupted near the ticket office. A man, dressed in rough, ill-fitting clothes and moving with a terrifying, purposeful speed, was fighting with two station porters. Subject 0. He hadn't been left behind. He had somehow managed to board the train, perhaps hiding in the freight car or beneath the coal tender. His chemical instability was now playing out in the public, crowded space of the Washington, D.C. terminal. He wasn't attacking indiscriminately. He was moving toward the exit, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen goal. But the violence of his movements, the pure, unadulterated strength, was causing mass panic. Thorne realized the horrific final twist in Rainey's plan. Subject 0 wasn't meant to be recaptured. He was Rainey's ultimate insurance policy. He is a distraction, Thorne whispered fiercely to Clara, pulling her toward a less crowded service exit. Rain knew we would come here. The subject is meant to create enough chaos and terror to confirm the media narrative that we brought the monster to the city. The subject's public presence is Rain's proof that we are dangerous fugitives. They slipped out of the station just as the first police whistles began to shrill. Subject 0, the genetically engineered anomaly, was now loose in the nation's capital, confirming Ronnie's carefully constructed lie and placing Thorne and Clara at the heart of an inescapable psychological trap. Thorne and Clara took refuge in a cramped, rented room, the city consumed by the frantic cries. The anomaly of Red Hollow is loose. Mad scientist's monster attacks D.C. Ronnie's control of the narrative was absolute. We have hours, maybe less, Thorne said, his voice flat with exhaustion. He had to process the film. He spread a blanket over a table, creating a makeshift dark room. He explained to Clara that Ronnie was simply using the subject's chemical instability to confirm the media's lies. Thorne developed the miniature film, finally revealing the terrifying image, the perfect circle of pinpricks above the neck, the indelible proof of the cranial implant. This, Clara, Thorne whispered, securing the print, is Ronnie's undoing. He cannot lie about physical evidence of unauthorized surgical implantation. As he secured the print, the door burst open. It was Dr. Eleanor Vance, Thorne's trusted colleague, but she was flanked by two grim-faced police officers. Vance was strained. Ronnie had convinced her that Thorne was having a psychotic episode and needed psychiatric observation. Rain's final cage. Psychiatric observation is Ronnie's final cage, Eleanor, Thorne roared. He will suppress the truth through medical detention. The proof is on this. He thrust the camera into her hand. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed from the street. Subject 0 was close, tearing apart a nearby electrical substation, the source of the high-frequency thrumming that had followed them from Red Hollow. Ronnie was using the city's infrastructure to drive the subject into a frenzy. Look at the picture, Eleanor, Thorne urged, pulling himself and Clara out onto the fire escape. Vance's eyes widened as she glanced down at the half-dry print. The irrefutable evidence of a surgical implant shattered her professional detachment. "Go, Elias," Vance shouted, turning her back on the officers. "I will secure the original files. I will make a copy of this and send it to the ethics board. I am with you." Vance slammed the door, choosing her side. Below, Subject Zero, with a final desperate heave, ripped the substation apart. The air was thick with sparks and dust, followed by sudden, absolute silence. The thrumming stopped. Subject Zero stood still, the silence a momentary balm. He looked at Thorne with profound gratitude. He was clear, rational, and had a new target: the American Scientific Institute headquarters, the heart of the conspiracy. Thorne and Clara had the proof and the ally. They now needed to witness the final reckoning. Thorne and Clara slipped into the observer's gallery of the Institute's boardroom. Inside, Rane, impeccable and composed, was delivering his final lie, presenting falsified documents to officials, requesting the lethal termination of the subject to end the civil catastrophe. Suddenly, the massive double doors were thrown open with jarring, explosive force. Subject Zero stood in the doorway, a figure of mud-splattered, terrible strength, his eyes fixed on Rane. Ran shrieked, scrambling back. The subject walked slowly, deliberately into the room. He didn't attack Rane. Instead, he stopped beneath Rane's portrait, let out a low, guttural sound of contempt, and plunged his fingers into the canvas, tearing Rane's image in half, a symbolic act of destruction. He then reached into his coat and pulled out a small, bloody metallic object, the cranial implant. He tossed the brain box onto the oak table, directly in front of the terrified Rane. Ran stammered, You removed it." Subject Zero looked directly into Rane's eyes and spoke for the first and only time. His voice was a deep rasp, but the word was perfectly clear. "Free." He turned and walked out, leaving Rane facing the undeniable proof of his crime. Thorne and Clara slipped out. The subject was free. The conspiracy was exposed. A week later, Thorne stood in a sterile office with Dr. Vance. Vance had secured the indictment. Ronnie was arrested, the banned experiment terminated, and Red Hollow was placed under quarantine for genetic treatment. Clara, now safe, was accepted as Vance's apprentice. "Rainey is disgraced, Elias. You did it," Vance said. "We did it," Thorne corrected. Subject Zero was never found. He had disappeared into the Appalachian Mountains, the man whose unique genetic resilience was now his only shield. He was the ghost of Rainey's ambition. Thorne carried the burden of knowledge, a scientist who had witnessed the monstrous potential of his own field. The horror was not in the monster, but in the men who created him, and the chilling realization that the capacity for such an experiment still exists, dormant in the institutions of power. The genetic truth was out, but the human cost remained, a permanent scar on the face of science.